يا راغبا في كل علم نافع.
ينمو العلم ويتقدم بتقنياته ومجالاته، ومعه نطور أدواتنا في تقديم العلم الشرعي. أكاديمية
زاد أكاديمية ينبوعها صاف ليروي غلة الظمآن، ومكارم الأخلاق ندرسها معا، أدب وتربية على الإحسان. بشرى لنا زاد أكاديمية للعلم كالأزهار في البستان.
السلام عليكم ورحمة الله. الحمد لله رب العالمين، والصلاة والسلام على أشرف المرسلين نبينا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. Continuing with the subject of al-khawf, and also we'll talk about not the opposite, but the other act of worship that balance it, which is al-raja, to hope for the rewards from Allah. Two acts of worship that are done by the heart, that has to be present in the heart, so that the person does not transgress the limits, and at the same time does not have the disparity from the mercy of Allah. So continuing with the subject of the fear of Allah, what are the means that would bring in our hearts the fear of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? And this is again such a beautiful act of worship that we need to establish it in our heart, how to have it in our lives. And once a person has the fear of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in their lives, as we talked about the rewards of it in the previous class, it's something that is such a beautiful thing that we should never ever miss. So what are some of these means from the Quran and the Sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ? Is to always remember and to exalt Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Remember the exaltation of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, nothing is the like of Him. And when human beings, they turn away from the book of Allah, they do not have this exaltation and the ta'zeem of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in their hearts. وَمَا قَدَرُ اللَّهَ حَقَّ قَدْرِ وَالْأَرْضُ جَمِيعًا قَبِضَتُهُ يَوْمَ الْقِيَامَةِ وَالسَّمَوَاتُ مَطْوِيَاتٌ بِيَمِينِهِ سُبْحَانَهُ وَتَعَالَى عَمَّا يُشْرِكُونَ. They did not estimate Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala the way it ought to be, while the earth is all in the hands of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in the day of Al-Qiyamah, and the heavens with His right hand subhanahu wa ta'ala عَمَّا يُشْرِكُونَ, what they associate partners with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And as the Prophet ﷺ, when he recited these verses one time on the mimbar, on the pulpit, and he said, يُمَجِّدُ الرَّبُّ نَفْسَهُ, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is exalting Himself, أَنَا الْجَبَّارِ أَنَا الْمُتَكَبِّرِ أَنَا الْمَلِكِ أَنَا الْعَزِيزِ أَنَا الْكَرِيمِ. I'm the irresistible, I'm the greatest subhanahu wa ta'ala, the Malik, the sovereign, the almighty, the most generous subhanahu wa ta'ala. And they said that the Prophet ﷺ caused the pulpit, the mimbar, to shake, till they said that he would fall. So to make ta'zeem of Allah, to exalt Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And we need to establish this by really being attached to the book of Allah and getting to know Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala with His names and attributes, and believing in Him subhanahu wa ta'ala in the right way. To witness and to bring this in our hearts as if we're seeing it with our own eyes, the fact that we will all be standing by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, something that is not going to be escaped whatsoever. Everybody is returning to Allah. Everyone shall return to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. No matter how long a person lives, there's a moment that would come where a person departs from this life and everyone will die. And this is what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَأَمَّا مَنْ خَافَ مَقَامَ رَبِّهِ وَنَهَى النَّفْسَ عَنِ الْهَوَى فَإِنَّ الْجَنَّةَ هِيَ الْمَأْوَى. Whoever fears Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala fears the day that he will be standing by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in the day of judgment, and as a result of that forbade oneself from following the desires. This is then the people like this is the Jannah, is their abode. Listening to the Quran, listening to the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ, admonitions, khutab, sermons, durus, matters of knowledge. And this is how the believers, their hearts would have the fear of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. All of that is by the mercy of Allah. Making dua, which is always the case. Anything that you would want to attain of goodness, a person should make dua to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. One of the dua of the Prophet ﷺ, he would say, Allahumma wa as'aluka khashyatak fil ghaybi wa shahada. Allah, I ask you to fear you in the matters unseen and the matters that are seen. So, and also the famous dua, اللهم اقسم لي من خشيتك ما تحول به بيني وبين معصيتك. O Allah, give me a portion of your fear that would make me away from disobeying you, O Allah. What makes a person fall into the sin is the lack or the deficiency or the weakness of the fear of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in the heart. Making lots of dhikr and remembrance of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that cure the heart from the disease of al-ghafla or forgetfulness. And the heart would keep on being in that state of forgetfulness, one step after the other, till the heart becomes hard and doesn't have the fear of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, does not get affected by the admonitions of the Quran, by the signs of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that's supposed to bring the fear of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in the hearts. That's why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala saying to the Prophet alayhi salatu wasalam and to the believers, وَلَا تُطِعْ مَنْ أَغْفَلْنَا قَلْبَهُ عَنْ ذِكْرِنَا وَاتَّبَعَ هَوَاهُ وَكَانَ أَمْرُهُ فُرُطًا. Do not obey those who we made their hearts heedless from the dhikr, from the remembrance of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. To stay away from the means that would bring the wrath of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, like the sins, like the love of this worldly life, like the bad companionship and friends and so on. These are means to attain. And we have to take the means. And when we read the Quran and we learn the knowledge of the Quran and the Sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ, then we would follow the Prophet ﷺ of how to fear Allah. Comes with al-khawf al-raja, which is another act of worship of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And al-raja is to hope for the rewards from Allah. And al-raja is a beautiful act of worship also, that it's a deed done by the heart. And it's not wishful thinking. It's hoping for the rewards of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala when a person is upon the obedience of Allah. He's a slave of Allah. He's fulfilling the commands of Allah and he hopes for the rewards from Allah. And the example of al-raja versus at-tamanni, which is wishful thinking, as the ulama they mention, is like someone, he has a piece of land and he wants to cultivate it, he wants to have plants, right? He would do one of two things. Either that he would sit by the land and he would say, I want my land to be fruitful. I hope that my land will have the best fruits. But he doesn't do anything. He does not put the seeds in the ground. He does not take the weeds away. He does not irrigate it. Does not do anything. That person is lying. Or if he's truthfully saying that, it's just wishful thinking. Is of no benefit whatsoever. Versus that he would say, I hope that my land will give the best fruits and so on. So he would take the means and put the seeds and irrigate it and take the weeds off and all kinds of things. This is what al-raja is supposed to be in the life of the believers. They're obedient to Allah. They're doing the things that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala commanded them to do. They're away from haram and they hope for the rewards from Allah. This is how al-raja is in their hearts. That's why the definition of al-raja is it's a relationship between the person and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that would get the heart to see the outcome and the hope that would keep the person going by the bounty of Allah, by the mercy of Allah, by seeking the pleasure of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala alone. The believers, they seek the pleasure of Allah, as Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, تَرَاهُمْ رُكَّعًا سُجَّدًا يَبْتَغُونَ فَضْلًا مِّنَ اللَّهِ وَرِضْوَانًا. You would see them making ruku' and making sujood, oftentimes, all the time, in a continuous way, seeking the pleasure of Allah, seeking the bounty of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and the pleasure of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala alone. And what opposes, what negates al-raja is al-yas, to be in disparity from the mercy of Allah, which is haram. إِنَّهُ لَا يَيْأَسُ مِنْ رَوْحِ اللَّهِ إِلَّا الْقَوْمُ الْكَافِرُونَ. Only the disbelievers are the ones that are in disparity from the mercy of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And that's why those who want to purify themselves, those who want to be close to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, they need to witness two things. One of which is to look at oneself. And this is such an important aspect of how to attain these beautiful acts of worship, so that the person does not fall into the trap of thinking bad about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala versus having ujb or liking oneself or arrogance. So how to protect oneself from this? Oftentimes people would say to you, have confidence in yourself. We say have confidence and rely upon Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So two things, if you have the proper witness of these two things, these are the keys of happiness in this life and in the hereafter. When you look at yourself in your ibadah to Allah, you should see it as deficient and it's weak. That is not the way it ought to be. So that would bring in your heart the fear of Allah, make you repent to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, make you humble. And at the same time, when you look at Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and the bounties of Allah and the mercy of Allah, then you will have the raja, you will have the hope for the rewards from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So you have good expectations in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Why? Because you don't see yourself as someone that in that level of goodness, right? Because you know yourself. But we know Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that He's the most merciful subhanahu wa ta'ala. We know that if He treats us with His justice subhanahu wa ta'ala alone, we are ruined. Why? Because we're sinful human beings. But rather we need the help from Allah and the mercy of Allah. That's why we hope for the mercy of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala versus someone that says, I deserve. No, you don't deserve anything. If you deserve, if you're treated by the justice of Allah, how many sins have been committed? But rather you say, I seek the mercy of Allah. I hope for the mercy of Allah. That's why, this issue of the differentiation between al-raja wa tamanni. Someone is lazy and he says, I hope. Versus someone that is taken the diligency and the path of goodness and he says, I hope. Completely different situations, and people can see that clearly in their life. And that's why Al-Hasan al-Basri rahimahullah says, إِنَّ قَوْمًا أَلْهَتْهُمُ الْأَمَانِيِّ حَتَّى خَرَجُوا مِنَ الدُّنْيَا وَمَا لَهُمْ حَسَنًا. Some people, the false hopes get them deceived till they wasted their life and they departed from this life and they have no hasana, no good deeds whatsoever. And one of them would say, إِنِّي أُحْسِنُ الظَّنَّ بِرَبِّي. They would say, I have good expectations and dhann from my Lord. And he says, وَكَذَبْ. He's a liar. Why? لَوْ أَحْسَنَ الظَّنَّ لَأَحْسَنَ الْعَمَلِ. If he have good expectations of his Lord, he would do good deeds and not to be deceived by one's laziness. That's why, as we talked about the fruits or the outcomes of the fear, also the fear, the raja or the hope for the rewards from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is a great consequences and goodness that makes the person always having the dhikr of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And this is one of the benefits of it. When you have hope, a real hope, what do? You're steadfast upon what would lead you to attain what you hope for. Because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's promise is the promise of the truth. And it makes the person pleased with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, pleased with the qadr of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, seeing this life as a test. If something good happens to him, he's grateful to Allah, seeking the rewards from that. If something good happens to him, he's grateful to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and he's seeking the pleasure of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala of that. Steadfastness upon acts of obedience to Allah. No matter what happens, he's steadfast. Why? Because he's constantly having the raja or the hope for the rewards from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. One of the great benefits of it, that it saves the person from the punishment of Allah. Because when you hope for something, you will always ask for it. That's why the one that is doing this act of ibadah, which is al-raja, he never quit making dua. Those who stop making dua, their dua is not accepted. Whether they are in haste or they lose that act of worship, which is al-raja. So this is how, or some of the benefits of it. How to attain this is by remembering the favors of Allah, by knowing the great bounties of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala upon us, by remembering the promise of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and the great rewards from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that He prepared for the believers. All of that we need to get to know it from the revelation from Allah, the Quran and the Sunnah of the Prophet alayhi salatu wasalam. To remember the vast mercy of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and that the mercy of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala comes before the anger of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Knowing Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala with His names and attributes, and how that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the most merciful, and He's the one that is the most just subhanahu wa ta'ala, and He's able to do all things. Therefore, when we look at this, we have fear of Allah, we have the hope for the rewards from Allah. And the believers, they have both. One of the very important matters in this subject is some people or some sects, when they leaned more over al-raja. And this is like the murji'ah and the like of them. They say no sin will harm one's iman, the iman is protected as a result of this false hope. Versus the other side, the other extreme, those who they said, they are ruined and everybody's ruined because of their sins and they become kuffar as a result of that. So the believers are always having both. in their hearts the fear of Allah and the hope for the rewards from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And it's like the two wings of a bird that helps the bird of always flying. Otherwise, a person is not able to do one versus the other. So this is where we need to expand upon and to get to know what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wants from us and the balance that we should have between these two acts of worship. We'll do that inshallah ta'ala in the next class. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to make us among those who are saved in this life and in the hereafter. Wa sallallahu wa sallam wa baraka ala Muhammadin wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa sallam. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
يا راغبا في كل علم نافع
ينمو العلم ويتقدم بتقنياته ومجالاته، ومعه نطور أدواتنا في تقديم العلم الشرعي. أكاديمية
زاد أكاديمية ينبوعها صاف ليروي غلة الظمآن، ومكارم الأخلاق ندرسها معا، أدب وتربية على الإحسان. بشرى لنا زاد أكاديمية للعلم كالأزهار في البستان.